Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and I really do hope that you're doing incredibly well and that you've had the most fabulous day. But before we get started, don't forget to get that lovely hot cup of cocoa or coffee or tea, whatever it is you drink, because I've got the most fabulous story for you tonight. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and a thumbs up. And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Rachel and I'm from Atlanta, which is a bustling, vibrant, diverse city situated among the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains at 1,050 feet above sea level, which is the highest elevation among major cities east of the Mississippi River. It is often referred to as the Big Peach or the City in the Forest, and is the capital and most populated city in the state of Georgia. I happily reside here in a leafy green neighbourhood where I live in a very attractive area north of downtown Atlanta known as Chastain Park with my fun-loving parents and my studious older brother Neil. We live in an elegantly restored old Tudor-style home with a very sizable front and back yard, which is lined with sumptuous green turf, a scattering of pretty trees, and a few colourful flower beds filled with seasonal flowers. My strange, rather incredulous, outlandish Bigfoot story begins in a way that I never imagined possible, for indeed I never considered that a Bigfoot story would ever cross my path, and certainly not in the way that it did. As invariably you always assume that a Bigfoot encounter is rather like the lottery, which means I never thought I would actually hit the jackpot myself. Well, certainly not in quite the way that I did. It all began when the COVID-19 pandemic broke around the world, which made my mother become unduly alarmed about my grandmother, who was in her 80s. At the time, she'd been living in a residential care home where a few people had suddenly just died from COVID. My mother thought that my grandmother might be predisposed and vulnerable to the virus given her age, fragility and weakened immune system, which was why she was desirous for her to move into our house forthwith, an idea that was exceedingly unbecoming to my father, who became very aggrieved and indignant about such a horrifying prospect. For a while, our normally tranquil, peace-loving home became rather like a war zone, where the verbal battles ensued in our sofa-covered living room and carpeted home, as my parents argued incessantly. My obstinate, pertinacious mother invariably always seemed to get her way in the end, and so for a couple of days our house descended into darkness as my sullen father sulked in the corner, barely saying a single word, while my mother prepared the spare room on the first floor of our home for my elderly grandmother Ruth. Within 2 days she'd moved into our home. My grandmother Ruth is a very sweet, frail, elderly woman who's actually as sharp as a hawk and incredibly observant. Yet at the same time, she's as gentle as a doe. I've always warmed to her because she is such a gentle, warm-hearted and congenial sort of person, and yet at the very same time, humorous as well. I remember when I was helping her unpack in her bedroom, she actually said to me, "Oh, I hope I'm not going to be an inconvenience for you all. I can see that your father isn't very happy to have me around, and I can't say I really blame him for that. This is all very awkward for all of us." "Don't worry about him, Granny," I said, giving her a reassuring hug. "Dad's just very set in his ways, that's all. He finds it rather difficult to adjust to different living circumstances. I wouldn't worry about it at all if I was you. He just needs to acclimatise to having you around. And once he's adjusted, he'll be fine, I promise you of that. I know what he's like." "Oh, I hope you're right," chided my grandmother, looking more than a little doubtful. I began to help my grandmother unpack, while she sat back on a comfortable chair watching me and directing me as to where to put her various things. Before long I was placing her neatly folded clothes into various drawers and hanging up all her pretty dresses and coats. I was about to put this long cardboard box into the cupboard when I discerned that it was full of these most magnificent drawings. "Granny," I said in shock, putting the box onto the bed and going through the pictures in awe. "These pictures are absolutely incredible. The colours are marvellous, and the drawings are exquisite. Did you draw these?" I asked. "They're stunning." "Yes, I did. When I was a young girl. Well, some of them anyway. Not all of them." I never knew you were an artist, I said, sifting through the pictures very briefly. You certainly know how to keep your light hidden under a bushel, Granny. You're a real talent, if ever I saw one. My grandmother chuckled. That's very kind of you to say so, dear. In those days I enjoyed drawing a great deal. I was a young girl then. It was one thing I could always do that didn't break the bank for my family. We were very poor back then. I sat down on the bed in my grandmother's bedroom and glanced through the pictures very briefly that she had drawn. Some were of her home, the pretty countryside, and even her family. And then there was another picture that caused the hair on the back of my head to stand on end, and my eyes to grow round as saucers, and my jaw to drop to the ground. My grandmother had drawn the perfect picture of a Sasquatch or a Bigfoot. How could she even have known about such a creature, I pondered. I was absolutely stumped. What's wrong, dear? She asked, her voice expressing concern. You look like you've seen a ghost. Your skin has grown as white as a sheet. Granny, I said, waving the picture of the Bigfoot towards her. What's this that you've drawn here? My grandmother giggled. Oh, that's Mops. Well, that's what my mother used to call him when I was growing up, because his rag-tailed hair looked like a mop. It was long and shaggy. He was a funny old thing, really. You mean you knew this creature? I asked, looking absolutely amazed. I sat down on her bed and insisted my grandmother told me the entire story from start to finish. So this is what she told me in her own words, which I now reveal to you. Well, dear, she proceeded to tell me, I grew up in the late Depression in the Appalachian, Kentucky area that stretches from Alabama to southern Pennsylvania. It was in the 1930s, and those grueling times were very hard indeed for the all of us, as there was very little employment back then due to the 1929 stock market crash, inexperienced Federal Reserve, and ill-timed tariffs, all collectively contributing to the ailing economy at the time. In those days we had to be very diligent and prudent and learn to survive, and that's what we did back then. We industrially grew our own vegetables and bottled and preserved them for the winter months. We raised chickens for eggs and we had a goat for milk. You really didn't have a choice in the matter, even if you wanted to. We were very frugal in those days, and we had a saying, use it up, wear it out, make do or go without. As a child, I'd scamper around the open wilderness in my bare feet, as shoes then were so expensive and my parents couldn't afford to buy me any. I never owned a pair of my own for a very long time. I would end up getting bitten by insects or spiky thorns would get embedded into my feet. But one day my father used the skins from a dead animal to make me a pair of boots, and that changed my life for the better, as he was a very resourceful man, and I still say to this very day that those boots were the very best I've ever owned. Even though things were very tough and Spartan in those days, I had a beautiful, idyllic and magical childhood. And when you're young and innocent, you believe that the thrifty, provident way that you live is perfectly normal, because you don't know any better. You think that being frugal and penny-wise is the natural way to survive. Not like it is today, dear, where there is just so much wastage in absolutely everything. It wasn't like that then. In those days we lived on meagre scant offerings, and we would eat potatoes with onions and hot dogs to fill up, or other cheap foods like beans, brown rice, oats and canned tuna or salmon, or sometimes mac and cheese. I remember one of my favourite foods was biscuits with creamed salmon. We lived in a very small rustic wooden cabin where we shared one queen-size bed together, which was occupied by both of my parents, my older brother Larry, and then me, of course. We would all have to squeeze together in one bed, but during the winter months it was very snug because we would keep each other incredibly warm. As a kid, I loved playing in the wilderness, the vast open prairies, the streams and the heavily wooded areas on our land. Growing up, Mops was a very normal part of my young life, and I played with him all the time. Of course, he was physically different to me, but when you're young, you accept people at face value and respect them the way they are, without considering their physical differences as strange or peculiar. Indeed, I never thought of such matters in regards to Mops. Granted, he was covered in long flowing brown hair, and he had feet that were padded at the bottom like a cat's, which I used to envy because he'd never get thorns in his feet or anything like that. He was able to run over the rough terrain and even on the snow with ease without getting his feet all cold. He was a creature of few words, but that really didn't matter to me. But he did speak to his mother in a chattering language, which I always found incredibly funny. When I was 10 years old, Mops was already about 5 foot tall and very heavy and stockily built. Not that that ever bothered me at the time. His height or his size was never an issue for me. Sometimes his height was a huge advantage for me, because he could reach the fruit on the trees that I couldn't get to, like peaches and apples, which was great, or biscuits that my mother had hidden from us on the top shelf of the pantry. We would play hide and seek, and Mops could hide in plain sight, and I'd never be able to find him. He was great at just vanishing into thin air, and he loved it when I couldn't discover his hiding spot. It used to drive me completely potty, so eventually he made himself a little easier to find, or I'd have given up on that game in a heartbeat. Yes, but I don't understand is how Mops just became a part of your family and your life in the first place. Well, that's another story, dear. I must have been about 2 years old, and my mother had placed me in a playpen outside my quaint little rustic cabin. It was like a fenced-in area that my father had made out of wooden pegs to keep me contained. In those days they could not afford toys, but my parents would put pine cones into the playpen and interesting pieces of driftwood, along with paper and crayons for me to play with, and I would be entertained while my mother cleaned out the house, always keeping her steely eyes pinned on me. One day when my mother came out into the yard to attend to my needs, she discovered little Mops had been placed in the playpen next to me. We were playing together very happily, like a couple of naughty juvenile toddlers, although Mops was physically bigger than me at the time. My mother was rather surprised and bewildered to see Mops in the playpen, and she wisely speculated that he was indeed the child of the wild woman, and instinctively sensed she needed her to babysit Mops, so that's exactly what she did. The wild woman would come and collect Mops later in the day, although she was never observed doing so by my mother. I think my mother was secretly pleased that I had a companion to play with, which meant I would get up to less mischief and was kept preoccupied by my little friend. I do remember she scrubbed Mops down a few times with a scrubbing brush and plenty of soap, and brushed out all the knots in his hair with a hairbrush, and he screamed blue murder like a baby because it hurt so much when my mother worked on all those tangles of his. After that fiasco, Mops was always wary of my mother, and when she came after him with a hairbrush, he would run and hide. He was so terrified of that thing, and if he saw a hairbrush, he would start to tremble and wobble like a jelly. If my mother ever wanted Mops to leave the house, all she had to do was wave that hairbrush at him, and he would vanish from sight, and we wouldn't see him for the rest of the day. Every time she upset Mops, he would spray the wall like a domestic cat in revenge and leave the most pungent odour behind in our house that would literally burn the back of your throats and hurt your eyes. It was a putrid smell, rather like hot garbage, and my mother hated it. Did your mother know this wild woman? I asked. No, you see, the introverted wild woman was very reticent, evasive and bashful, but my mother had seen her in passing in the wood green, and their eyes met on many occasions. I think she liked the timorous wild woman and understood her diffidence better than most. You see, growing up, my mother herself had been painfully shy, so she rarely related to the demure wild woman. I know she spotted her capricious elderly partner once or twice in the forest, whom she described as a very sizable, fractious old fellow, whom she believed was a little cantankerous, grouchy and rather moody. You could tell he was old, as his grey hair was turning white, and his leathery, weathered grey face looked literally ancient and shrivelled up like a wizened old tortoise. That was how wrinkled he was. She perceived that the wild woman brought Mops to play with me so that his mischievous games and animated high-pitched whoops would not upset and unnerve the cranky, crotchety old fellow. I do remember when I was playing in the sylvan with Mops, the crusty old fellow heard us as we were chasing each other around the grove. I was shrieking wildly with laughter, and Mops was whooping in delight because he perceived that I'd never catch him, as Mops could run like the wind. I've never seen anything that could run that fast. I will never forget the petulant old fellow who'd been watching us sternly with angry eyes. He lunged towards me, shaking his gargantuan fists at me in a furious rage, and he began to scream so loudly that he sounded like a woman being murdered. Then he curled back his lips and unleashed the most terrifying growl and leered at me with his hostile eyes. I could tell that he was incandescent with rage, which caused my whole body to shake like a leaf. I was certain in that moment that the quick-tempered old man was about to hit me really hard, but that was when the unassuming wild woman came to my immediate rescue. She ushered the old man away, talking to him very softly in a chattering tone that seemed to calm him down. I always got the impression that Mops kept a safe distance from the narky old fellow, as I think he was fickle at the very best of times. He was a scary individual. He was thickly built like an army tank, and was easily over 8 foot tall and even more than 700 pounds, and possibly 3 foot wide. Over the years, the magnanimous wild woman brought my family generous open-handed gifts of deers, hogs, rabbits, fish, and other food sources in exchange for taking care of Mops. We would discover these bountiful trophies on our front door, along with a bucket of wild berries or fruits from time to time, which my mother would bottle or make into delicious jams. As far as my parents were concerned, looking after Mops was a lifesaver for our family. It was like earning a very decent, highly desirable wage package, because it meant we had meat every single day of our lives, which alleviated our hunger pangs and satiated us considerably. It would seem that life became a great deal better and easier for us in our home, because we all went to bed with full satisfied stomachs, thanks to the wild woman, and we were healthier too. My father, who had never been best pleased about my relationship with Mops and thought it was a bit unusual, shut up after the meat kept arriving on our doorstep, let me tell you that. Whereabouts did Mops live, I asked. Well, he lived in the woods in a cave with his mother and dad. I remember he showed me the place once when we were playing in the grove. You would never have known it was even there. It was concealed by thick brush and thicket, and it was fully protected from all the elements. It was a cosy, sumptuous den, lined with lots of animal pelts and tree stumps and so forth. So how long were you friends with Mops, I asked. I think I was about 12 years old when Mops and his mother went away to pastures new, because they were, like nomads, following waterways, railway lines and animal trails, as that's how the wild men in those days lived. I think the only reason they stayed in our vicinity for so long is because of the grumpy old man, who was tired and weary and incapacitated by his leg that appeared to give him a great deal of trouble. He would drag it on the ground behind him. My mother believed it had once been caught in a trap before and had given him a great deal of grief ever since. She thought that he might have insufferable pain, which could have accounted for his volatile temper. Of course, when he died, everything changed after that. It was a very sad, grievous time for the all of us. Even my father missed the free meat deliveries at our front doorstep, and life went downhill from then on, as we had to resort to living on beans and rice, and it wasn't easy, let me tell you. How did the old man die? I asked. Well, I remember one day the wild woman beckoned to my mother and indicated for her to follow her, which was a very big deal for us because she was desperately shy, and although she would make her presence known, she liked to remain hidden in the shadows. We barely ever saw her unless she crossed our path and glanced at us ever so briefly. On this occasion, however, the wild woman stepped out of her comfort zone, which wasn't easy for her at all, and she led my mother to the open grave that she had dug in the grove, only yards away from where the cave was where the family lived. I remember getting such a shock when I observed the old man lying next to the open grave, with his deceased body. It was so withered. I could see that despite his great size and girth, he was emaciated and drawn. I'd never seen a dead body before that, and in my eyes he was very human to me, despite all the hair and his gargantuan size. I must say he looked very peaceful in death. My mother believed he'd died in his sleep or something, and you could see that the wild woman loved him so very much. I could discern the distress in her eyes, and how desperately sad she was. I remember my mother took the wild woman into her arms, and they locked in a warm embrace. She patted her gently on her hair-covered back, and she kept saying, "I'm so sorry, you poor, poor thing. It must be very hard for the both of you." The wild woman really looked comforted by my mother's kind, gentle words, and the compassion that she showed her. I could tell that she loved my mother very much, even though they had so little contact. She patted my mother's back as well. It was an emotional, loving embrace. Was Mops sad about his dad's death? No, not really. I think he was actually rather relieved, to tell you the truth. I sensed his fractious relationship with his father was combustible at the very best of times. I think the poor old man possibly found Mops rather too rambunctious and feisty for his liking. So what happened next? Well, the wild woman buried the old man while we all watched the procedure. It was really rather peculiar, but she wanted to include us in the ceremony, and I realised then that she considered us a huge part of her life, which was incredibly moving, especially for my mother, who was touched to the quick. I noticed Mama was actually crying when the old man was buried. I think she was so sad for the wild woman. Once the old man was buried, the wild woman put some sticks into the ground to mark the grave, and then she let out the most appallingly loud howls. I even began to weep when she howled, because you could feel her desperate pain. And then once she'd finished grieving, she pointed towards the east, and my mother knew that they were leaving and moving on. We were all grievously sad, and said our goodbyes. I remember we patted each other on the backs and nodded, and I just wept and wept when I saw them go. It really felt like a death and a dreadful loss. I was so sad. I remember after they left, life got really hard again. Obviously, we no longer had the meat deliveries from the wild woman, and I missed Mops so much. He had been my very best friend growing up. I never stopped crying for days. I used to beg God to bring him back to us, but he and his mother, they never returned. I begged God to make them return, but it just never happened. My mother believed that the wild woman, who was still very young at the time, had possibly found a new love. My mother was so sad. She told me she never realised how much the wild people had impacted her life. We always went to the grave of the old man and prayed for him and laid down flowers for him on the anniversary of his death every single year. Wow, I said, what a story! I said this looking at the picture my gran had painted of the critter with a pyramid-shaped head, overlong arms and hair-covered body. As my grandmother looked at the picture, I could see the tears welling in her eyes and streaking and falling down her cheeks as she remembered little Mops. So this is Mops, I said, studying the picture. It's a really good picture. He looks really sweet. His eyes look very kind. My grandmother was still crying, wiping away her tears. Oh, he was kind, she said, very kind. And if you think that's a good picture, she said, look at these. My grandmother showed me some other pictures that had been meticulously done by a fine artist. Who did these? These were done by Mops. Mops drew these pictures? I asked in astonishment. My grandmother nodded. He was a great artist, and we would draw together for hours. He was far better than me. He knew how to draw the natural world. You see, he knew it so much better than I did. That's extraordinary, I said. He was such a phenomenal artist. I can't believe it. Suddenly I remembered the picture from the Patterson-Gimlin footage, and I took out my mobile phone and showed the footage to my grandmother. I wanted to see what she thought of the creature that many have speculated for so long and wondered if it was real. What do you think of this footage, Granny? I asked. That looks a lot like the wild woman, said my grandmother, only she was much taller and slimmer. But she did look like that. It's a great footage, she said, and it's definitely real. It's not fake. You can see the muscles moving under the arms, and you can see the areas where the animal doesn't have hair. That was similar to the wild woman. As you can imagine, I was thrilled that my grandmother could share the story with me, and if she had not stayed in our home, I would never have known about her encounter with the hairy man. I told my grandmother that the critters are known as Bigfoot, but she said Mops and the wild woman were like people to her, but people with hair and pyramid-shaped faces and very powerful, strong bodies. But they're just like us, she told us, with emotions and feelings. Don't ever forget that. You cannot say they're animals because they're intelligent and discerning. I did tell her that some people had terrifying encounters with the critters, and she believes that they are actually misunderstood. They do have an intrinsic ability to read your mind, she did tell me. I do know Mops was always able to know what I was thinking. And that was proven one day when we played a game where I'd draw a picture on a piece of paper and he had to guess what I'd drawn. And he always got it right. If I drew an apple or a house, he drew exactly what I'd drawn. So he was very, very telepathic. I imagine if a hunter was thinking I'm going to kill this wild man, he would be in pretty much big trouble, because the wild man would already have perceived his thoughts and quickly defend himself. Also, if you display fear, that would be a red flag to a wild man. You see, the wild man would see your fear as an invitation to attack, as all the other animals they hunt are afraid of them as well. But do you believe that there are bad wild men? Of course I do, just as there are bad men in our world. It really is not much different than that. The problem is if you're dealing with an aggressive wild man, you'll be in big trouble because they're colossal, dangerous, and they'll kill you in a heartbeat. My grandmother still lives in our house to this day, and my father has warmed to her considerably because she's a very likeable old lady. So there you are. That's my story. What an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.